Dzień dobry Państwu. Witam bardzo serdecznie na kolejnym wykładzie z serii Nowa ekonomia czasów kryzysu, serii wykładów, w których moderatorem i pomysłodawcą jest pan profesor Jerzy Osiatyński. Dziś naszym gościem będzie pan profesor Jana Toporowski z londyńskiej School of African and Oriental Studies. Myślę, że jego dzieło i osobę przybliży nam nieco pan profesor Osiatyński, a tytuł dzisiejszego wykładu to Postkeynesowska Monetary Theory and Policy. I w tej sytuacji przekażę głos panu profesorowi Jerzemu Osiatyńskiemu, który poprowadzi również dyskusję po wykładzie.
Dziękuję bardzo. Dzień dobry Państwu. Miło Państwa znowu widzieć po pewnej przerwie. Pan profesor Toporowski od wielu lat zajmuje się zagadnieniami finansów i bankowości z punktu widzenia teorii Keynesa-Kaleckiego, ze szczególnym pochyleniem na teorię Kaleckiego. W ubiegłym roku ukazał się pierwszy tom dwutomowej biografii autorstwa pana profesora Toporowskiego, biografii Michała Kaleckiego. Drugi tom jest w przygotowaniu. Czekamy na ten drugi tom i mamy wielką nadzieję, że przyniesie równie wiele satysfakcji i nowych, ciekawych informacji, jak ten, który jest już dostępny. Od ostatnich 2 czy 3 lat pan profesor Toporowski bardzo dużo publikuje i wykłada na temat kryzysu finansowego, pokazując jednocześnie historię sporów wokół tego, na czym powinna polegać polityka pieniężna. Czy istotą polityki pieniężnej na pewno i przede wszystkim są stopy procentowe. Jak z upływem czasu zmieniały się poglądy i zmieniała się skuteczność instrumentarium, które miało zapewnić niską inflację, kontrolowaną inflację, przy możliwie pełnym zatrudnieniu. Jak długo pełne zatrudnienie należało do obszaru celów polityki gospodarczej. Bo jak wiemy, w ostatnich 20-30 latach, może nawet dłużej, gdzieś od połowy lat 70., ten cel pełnego zatrudnienia stopniowo odchodził i dzisiaj w tym głównym nurcie ekonomii nie odgrywa aż tak istotnego znaczenia. Nie chcę dalej odwlekać momentu, w którym będziecie mogli Państwo posłuchać pana profesora. Chcę tylko powiedzieć na koniec ostatnią rzecz. Jak Państwo mogli się przeczytać w biografii, pan profesor jest ekonomistą polsko-brytyjskim, czy też brytyjsko-polskim, jakkolwiek urodził się w Oksfordzie. Ale mówi po polsku. I my tu mamy taki, ja powiem, właściwie pewien schemat informacyjny i większość naszych gości mówi po angielsku i ten wykład jest po angielsku. Dzisiejszy wykład odbędzie się w języku polskim. To zważywszy także na naszych słuchaczy poza tą salą, może być dodatkową zaletą. Bardzo proszę, ja
Po polsku, po angielsku.
Bo jest gości na sali anglojęzycznych tylko.
A są tylko angielskojęzyczne?
Tak jest.
Okej, dobrze, przepraszam bardzo. W takim razie mówię. Okej. In that case, I can already made my introduction. I will not make it again in English.
Dziękuję bardzo. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. Very honored to be here. Krytyka pieniężna is a very important institution. I myself have been to at least one of its meetings in London, and I'm aware that this is something that we lack in England. It's very important, I think, to have this forum for discussion. I'm also very grateful for the opportunity to speak in English, because although I can lecture in Polish, it's rather easier for me in English. This is something that I do most working days. I'll talk today about post-Keynesian monetary theory and policy. Why post-Keynesian and why is it important? For me, this is important because when I first became an academic, after I finished my doctorate, I should say, I worked in banking. In 1987, I ceased working for a bank, and I became an academic. And I was surprised to find that the mainstream of economic theory had very little to say about finance. There was finance in mainstream economics is a matter of portfolio choice. Otherwise, it doesn't appear in economics, or in a very sketchy way. There was only one school of thought that took finance seriously, and that was the post-Keynesian school. So I will talk today about post-Keynesian monetary theory and policy to show what are its most important doctrines, to show how those doctrines have changed, but also to show why they are important for understanding finance. Let me give a summary of what I will say. I've called this stages of belief and doubt in post-Keynesian monetary theory, simply because in post-Keynesian economics has changed over the years. What is called post-Keynesian economics was something different in the 1950s. It became something different in the 1970s and the 80s, and now it is something different again. Simply because the economic situation has changed from between stages. There was a period in the post-war period of cheap but controlled money, and post-Keynesian economics addressed this with a particular set of doctrines. With inflation and the rise of monetarism, there were new ideas of monetary endogeneity. Some of these gave rise eventually to a circuit theory of money. When the new consensus on monetary policy appeared in the 1990s, again, post-Keynesian economics adapted itself to that. And towards the end of that, in the 1990s, 2000s, we had the rise of a particular branch, people who were associated with post-Keynesian economics, modern money theory. And finally, I will conclude by saying a few words about monetary policy and the business cycle. All of these theories, by the way, reach back to Keynes and Keynesian ideas. In many respects, this is very easy to do because, as is well known, Keynes changed his mind a lot. It's possible to find very many different ideas in Keynes, and it's an indication of both of the seriousness of Keynes's ideas, but also the way in which he changed his mind, that at various times something different can be found in Keynes's ideas. The post-war monetary policy and post-war monetary ideas of Keynes were interpreted by Keynes's friend Richard Kahn, and also by Nicholas Kaldor, as with certain very specific doctrines. It took place in the context of wartime credit controls. It's sometimes believed that the post-war period owes its essential monetary framework to the system established at Bretton Woods, the system of international monetary rules set up at Bretton Woods. This is not quite true. The post-war monetary order was largely an extension of wartime credit controls, with three elements in them. First of all, low interest rates to finance a large government debt, particularly in the United Kingdom. The British government ended the war with a government debt to GDP ratio of well over 200%. For this, it was necessary to have low interest rates, simply to minimize the cost of financing that large debt. This could, of course, be rationalized or a rationalization for this could be found in the work of Keynes, because Keynes, from the 1930s onwards, advocated a permanent regime of low interest rates. A second element of the post-war monetary order were credit controls, for two reasons. One was to direct credit. The economists who were who inspired and who directed monetary policy and economic policy after the war were very well aware, or mostly influenced by their experience of the 1930s, a period of industrial decline, very low investment, and they believed that credit should be controlled and directed to support, first of all, investment, and secondly, exports. Exports were necessary because it was essential to have balanced trade, and the reason why it was necessary to have balanced trade was because of the regime of fixed exchange rates. Under the system of fixed exchange rates, if there was a trade deficit, the central bank had to supply foreign currency, and to economize on those kinds of operations, governments aimed at balanced trade and preferably as an export surplus. The other reason for directing credit was an entirely non-Keynesian one, or certainly not later Keynesian. This was in order to keep down inflation. It's sometimes believed, certainly by many post-Keynesian economists, that in the post-war period everyone was Keynesian. This is not true. Everyone wasn't Keynesian. Very many economists still believed in the quantitative theory of money. They still believed that it was necessary to restrict credit in order to prevent inflation happening, because if you had too much credit in the economy, there would be inflation. So this was the second reason for having credit controls. And the third element of the wartime, the post-war monetary order were fixed exchange rates. This was a belief, again, a reaction to what had happened in the 1930s, a belief that the destruction of the gold standard was an aberration. It had given rise to competitive devaluation, and in Europe in particular, this was a bad thing. This undermined economic policy, and in particular in a continent like Europe, where you have some small countries, some medium-sized countries, and only one or two large countries. The exchange rate is a sensitive issue. We don't have to go into this, but the issue, exchange rates are a lasting theme of post-war economic management was the need to maintain fixed exchange rates. And I think today, as we view the crisis in the Eurozone, in the European Monetary Union, it's easy to forget that the reason why we have a European Monetary Union was because the attempts to maintain fixed exchange rates failed, and there is still, or there was a belief that going back to floating exchange rates would be a bad thing in Europe, just simply because of the amount of imported inflation that comes into an economy because of when you have devaluation. So it's fixed exchange rates. This apparently idyllic post-war order, many post-Keynesian economists, many even Marxist economists refer to this the post-war period as the golden age. This system broke down due to principally two reasons. One was low but creeping inflation. Inflation tended to rise, in particular as economies approached full employment, there's a tendency for inflation to rise. When I say creeping inflation, it never went up higher than about 4 or 5%. On average, it was fairly low. It's certainly low by later standards. I think the peak of inflation occurred during the Korean War in the early 1950s. So this was for economists who, for some economists, particularly right-wing economists, who believed that the system of full employment was fundamentally wrong. They would point to this creeping inflation and say that, in the words of the Polish economist Kalecki, the situation is manifestly unsound. Inflation is but round the corner, and at any moment it will become hyperinflation on the scale of what happened in Weimar Germany. This never actually happened, but you can always stir up fears with by making extreme forecasts. And I don't need to remind you of this in a country where you have, on the main crossroads in Warsaw, a reminder of the inexorable rise of government indebtedness. The second reason for the failure of post-war Keynesianism was the rise of informal markets. This was through in two ways. First of all, banks found that they could avoid credit controls by setting up subsidiaries which were not registered as banks but did banking business. If you didn't do banking business openly with the public, then you could do banking business more discreetly outside the regulations. These were known as non-bank banks or secondary banks. The second kind of informal markets were the euro markets. These were, in fact, explicitly sponsored by the monetary authorities in two countries, in Switzerland and in the United Kingdom, where the financial and monetary authorities were prepared to tolerate banking in foreign currency, providing the foreign currency deposits were held by non-residents. So if you came from outside Switzerland, you could open a dollar bank account in Switzerland outside the Swiss banking regulations. In October 1957, the British banks asked the Bank of England for permission to offer dollar bank deposits for non-UK residents, and the Bank of England gave them that permission. They believed that they would be able to maintain their banking regulations. In fact, what happened was that, first of all, American financial institutions and then, American corporations, but then other businesses started holding their dollars, not in New York, where they were subject to regulation, but in London and in Switzerland. And gradually this gave rise to an informal foreign exchange market, and effectively this undermined fixed exchange rates and credit controls. I mention this because it's sometimes argued by many economists on the left that the Keynesian controls were undermined by neoliberalism, that Hayek was in Chicago, and from Chicago a neoliberal virus spread amongst economists and among policymakers, and this caused the deregulation of the financial markets. This wasn't true. What happened was that the regulation of the financial markets was undermined principally by means of these informal markets. The process of deregulation was greatly accelerated in the 1970s by stagflation, with the rise in price of raw materials. There was stagflation arose, a period when there was unemployment rising very rapidly, as well as inflation. And this caused problems for Keynesian theory, specifically because Keynesian theory, Keynesian economics really did not have an explicit theory of inflation to guide policy. The only widely accepted theory about inflation at the time was the so-called Phillips curve. But this was a supposed stable relationship between inflation and unemployment. But it really had very little theory about it. It was more an empirical observation. And in the 1970s, it appeared to break down because, according to the Phillips curve, if you have rising unemployment, you have falling inflation. In fact, in the 1970s, in Britain and in the United States and in Europe, you had both rising inflation and rising unemployment. At this point, monetarism, which had always stayed on the margins, existed on the margins of economic theory, came back to the center of policy making, arguing that inflation is caused by the growth of the money supply. Now, what was meant by the money supply was not made clear. It was not clear from the way in which this was put forward. The more sophisticated monetarist economists realized that in the modern world, in the world that already existed in the United States and Great Britain, the most common form of money is credit. And credit is outside the control of the central bank. Credit is something which a commercial bank gives to its clients who come to us to borrow or will have deposits in the bank. It's a relationship between households, firms, governments, and commercial banks. The central bank stands behind the commercial banks. The answer to this was an American doctrine, the reserve position doctrine. This is the idea that credit is determined by the amount of bank reserves. In other words, the amount of deposits that commercial banks hold with the central bank. this point, Caldor emerged. Nicholas Caldor came in probably he died, I think, 1986. So this was probably the last years of his life. He put forward the first, I believe, modern post-Keynesian doctrine, i.e. a doctrine which was, you could find in Keynes, but it was not explicitly in Keynes. He, in a number of speeches and some articles, Caldor, which were brought together in a book called The Scourge of Monetarism, Caldor put forward the essential doctrine of post-Keynesian monetary theory. This is the doctrine that the money supply is not a policy instrument. The monetary authorities, whether it's the central bank or the government, cannot determine the money supply. Why? Because the money supply is endogenous. This is a term taken from economic modeling. It means that it's determined within the model, within the economic system, by other variables which are the decision variables. So a government may decide, for example, the tax rate. The government may decide the level of certain welfare benefits, or how much it spends on defence. But in Caldor's view, the money supply is determined within the economic system at the point at which the commercial banks deal with their customers, their commercial and their household customers. And in the normal formulation of it, endogenous money means that the supply of money is determined by the demand for it. Banks will not turn down a good customer. And they have two mechanisms for adapting the supply of credit to the demand for it. First of all, banks hold excess reserves. They hold excess reserves so that they can accommodate new credit demands. So if I go to my bank and ask for a loan and I have good security, so the bank can satisfy my demand for credit. So banks hold excess reserves. In other words, they hold reserves over and above what they hold deposits at the central bank over and above what the reserves that they are required by the banking regulations. So that's one way in which this is done. And Caldor showed in his famous, in his book, how much extra reserves the English clearing banks were holding. Secondly, even if they did not hold excess reserves, if banks overall wanted to satisfy their customers, they would offer them credits, and then they would come to the central bank with a request to borrow reserves from the central bank. And the central bank would accommodate that demand. Why? Because if the central bank didn't, then they would have, the central bank would face a difficulty of disorderly money markets. Either that the rate of interest would go very high, or that banks would become insolvent because they didn't have sufficient From this, perhaps the most important book of that period emerged, a book by the American post-Keynesian economist Basil Moore. Basil Moore talked about verticalists and horizontalists. This was a way of thinking about the demand and supply of money. Basil Moore argued that the central bank can control the money supply, but not its price, the price of money being the rate of interest. If the central bank insisted on restricting the money supply, then it would run the risk that it would lose control of the rate of interest, and the rate of interest would rise dramatically. And indeed, this is what happened. In the period of the late 1970s and early 1980s, the money supply, the central bank tried to control the money supply. The rate of interest rose quite dramatically. The effects of this were immediately became apparent. In the United States, you had the savings and loan crisis. In the United States, households borrow money to buy housing. They borrow money at fixed interest rates. So households that have borrowed money at a fixed interest rate simply held on to their mortgages when interest rates went up. Savings and loan associations found that they were having to pay higher interest rates on their deposits, and this caused a number of savings and loan associations to collapse. Fraud emerged, and there was a crisis there. In the developing countries, there was this whole attempt to hold the money supply caused an international debt crisis, and with a number of governments, including governments in Mexico, the government of Poland, defaulting on their foreign debts. According to Basil Moore, what was needed was an accommodating central bank to stabilize interest rates. And sure enough, as a result of the international debt crisis, both the Federal Reserve and other central banks started to accommodate interest rates. So in the 1980s, post-Keynesian economics meant the view that monetarism was wrong, interest rates were unstable if you tried to control the money supply, and the various key point was how to stabilize demand and supply of money, viewed as the demand and supply of bank reserves. As another group of post-Keynesian economists known as the structuralists, principally associated with the work of Marc Lavoie, Sheila Dow, but I think probably most importantly Victoria Chick, argued that in fact with banking innovation, credit is no longer a commodity with a determinate supply and demand for money. This was, you had new types of financial instruments, and there were credit counterparts for these. Those financial instruments could be used as security for new credit, and this was the way in which the credit system operated. They attached a lot of importance to Keynes's finance motive for holding money. Keynes's finance motive was a view that Keynes put forward after the general theory in 1937. The idea that in the banking system you have something like a revolving fund of finance, that the banks would give advance credit to firms for investment. Firms, as they repaid that credit, this would give banks the resources to make new advances, so that in fact this kind of credit really can be done without any changes in the amount of bank reserves. So control of bank reserves cannot control this type of credit. For those that knew their monetary theory well, there was appeal to the work of two monetary economists. One of them was Hartley Withers. Hartley Withers, very interesting English economist, certainly not an academic, but a very prolific writer in the 1900s. Hartley Withers, his most famous book was The Meaning of Money. He wrote about this kind of monetary innovation. And in particular, he said that in a credit economy, it's no longer bank deposits which are then lent on by banks to their customers, but in fact, if banks make advances, and those advances, those loans, create deposits. Why? Because if I borrow money from a bank to buy a house or to set up an enterprise, my loan then creates a deposit. I use this deposit to pay for the house or to pay the costs of my enterprise. That money, that credit that advance enters into circulation as a bank deposit. So this was an idea which Schumpeter took up, later on took up, the idea that it's the process of lending money that creates deposits, and not as in the 19th century where you first had to make a deposit at a bank, and then with the bank deposit could then be lent on. And why is this important? Because the idea is that in the 19th century, banks' lending was restricted by the amount of deposits that they had. By the 20th century, banks could create as much credit as they wanted. On the margins of all this was someone who I think is probably the most interesting figure in post-Keynesian economics, Hyman Minsky, a student of Oscar Lange. Oscar Lange had two important students when he was in Chicago. One of them was Hyman Minsky, the other one, a far more scandalous figure, Richard Milhouse Nixon. Minsky took some of his ideas from Schumpeter, quite a lot of them from Keynes, particular highlighted the fact that in Keynes, it's not the short-term rate of interest that is important, it's the long-term rate of interest. Why? Because when firms invest, they use either their own funds or they borrow money short-term, but eventually firms will seek to fund their investment with a long-term debt or shares. And this is, and the cost of financing that investment is the cost of that long-term debt or the shares. Therefore, this is something that you find also in Kaletsky. So it's that long-term rate of interest plus the expected return on an investment that determines how much investment takes place. Why is investment important? And here, Minsky took over what I think is the most important macroeconomic doctrine of Keynes and Kaletsky, the realization that the idea that an economy is brought into equilibrium not by prices and wages, not by flexible prices or wages, not by flexible interest rates or exchange rates. These cannot do the job. What brings an economy into equilibrium is the level of investment. If you have a sufficiently high investment, you can get full employment. If you have too high investment, you get inflation. If you have too low investment, then you have unemployment and economic stagnation. Minsky added to this a very important idea, and that is that you need to have a sufficiently, that alongside the system of production and distribution of income in the economy is a system of debt structures which need to be serviced out of income. And this is where investment takes on a very, very important financial role for Minsky. Investment needs to achieve a certain level if there are sufficient incomes to be generated in the economy to service debt. If investment falls below that threshold, then this appears in a complex financial economy as debt problems. The kind of difficulties that we have in Europe at the moment, or certainly in the UK. If investment is above that threshold, then it appears as if finance is working perfectly, everyone's receiving incomes, there are no problems servicing the debt. So this is a debt theory of production. Not necessarily that debt is needed for production, but that debt structures exist alongside the system of production, exchange, and distribution of income. In the 1980s, a second post-Keynesian stream emerged, and this was the circuit theory of money. One of the founders of this was a very interesting Italian economist, Augusto Graziani. Incidentally, whereas the previous post-Keynesian theory of Minsky, Victoria Chick, Paul Davidson, who I haven't mentioned, but Caldor and so on. This was in the English-speaking world. The second theory of money emerged in France and Italy, Germany. Key figures there were Augusto Graziani, French economist Bernard Schmidt, Claude Noss, Alain Pargues, now very elderly gentleman. Alain Pargues, who I remember one of my discussions with him, he told me about, how when he was a young man, his father, Pargues' father was an economist who knew Kaletsky, and he remembered Kaletsky coming to dinner at their house in Paris.
That must be 36.
Possibly 36, yes. Alain Pargues is Alain Pargues is a very interesting and lively speaker. He has a fund of scandalous stories, including that of his mother. His mother was apparently a very beautiful lady who had a liaison with François Mitterrand immediately before the war, as a result of which Alain Pargues was in Mitterrand's circle in 1980. This group of economists adhere to derive their ideas essentially from Marx and Keynes, in particular from particular remarks that Keynes made in the early 30s about the theory of Marx. Keynes actually didn't know terribly much about Marx, didn't think that he was terribly important. But the one thing that he picked up on was the idea of circuits of capital, the idea that the economy consists of capital and circulation. And the other, this inspired the circuit theory of money. They then added to this a monetary theory, added some Keynesian ideas, particularly the original title of Keynes' general theory, which was a monetary theory of production. The essential idea in this theory is that capitalists borrow money when production starts. They borrow it in order to finance production, in other words, to buy raw materials, really for working capital, raw materials, components, to pay wages, and then they repay it on the sale of in general, the circuit theory of money people were quite sympathetic to the ideas of Kaletsky. So if you have working capital like this, of course you need to explain, well, where does the profit come from? Because if you pay your costs of production, you borrow the money for costs of production, you repay your borrowing from the sale of your goods. How does profit, how do firms make a profit? Well, this is in the Kaletsky theory of profits. This is from investment. In fact, you find this in Keynes as well. I would say, however, that this is, for me, this is a decidedly odd view. And I would contrast this with the view of Kaletsky himself at the end of his wielu ekonomistów zakłada, przynajmniej w swych abstrakcyjnych teoriach, istnienie demokracji gospodarczej, w której każda jednostka obdarzona zdolnościami przedsiębiorczymi może uzyskać kapitał potrzebny do uruchomienia jakiegoś przedsięwzięcia. This is a very Schumpeterian idea. Taki obraz działalności czystego przedsiębiorcy jest, łagodnie mówiąc, nierealny. Najważniejszym warunkiem, aby ktoś mógł stać przedsiębiorcą, jest własność kapitału. Incidentally, this by własność kapitału, by ownership of capital. So Kalecki is arguing that the primary precondition for being a capital is ownership of capital.
Sorry to interrupt you. For the benefit of the whole, the quotation is from the theory of economic dynamics.
Yes, yes.
Sorry.
And he defined, capitalists for Kalecki are defined by ownership of capital, not by entrepreneurial skills. He said it's an idealistic utopia to believe that if I'm entrepreneurial, I can somehow raise finance. This is also a Schumpeterian myth. You find this myth in Schumpeter, and even I should say in parts of Marx. It's ownership of capital, and by ownership of capital, Kalecki meant clearly ownership of money capital. In his theory of the business cycle, he has in his earliest model of the business cycle a very clear statement of this. How does the boom start? The boom starts with capitalists shifting their money from reserve accounts to operating accounts from which they pay which they use as their working capital. They pay their costs of production. Just quickly on the new consensus on monetary policy. The monetarism, of course, broke down for two reasons. One is the inability of central banks to control the money supply. By the end of the 1980s, this was fairly obvious. And there were murmurings among central banks. People like Charles Goodhart, at the time chief economist at the Bank of England, was saying, well, no, this idea that the central bank can control the money supply is nonsense. Money is endogenous. And so central banks starting to adopt the key doctrine of post-Keynesian economics, the endogeneity of money. But the second aspect of monetarism, which totally discredited it at the time, was the fact that in the monetarist doctrine, if the money supply is rising, so should inflation. At the end of the 1980s, you had the reverse situation arising. Inflation was falling while the money supply was expanding. And this is incorrect. Central banks accepted monetary endogeneity, with the exception of certain sections of the Bank for International Settlements and the Bundesbank, today incorporated in the Maastricht Treaty, that the European Central Bank has to look at the money supply as one of its indicators for monetary policy. The new consensus emerged. The new consensus is the view that it's the short-term interest rate that determines output, and inflation is formalized in the Taylor rule, which effectively replaces the Phillips curve. The origins of this are in really Austrian or Thessalian economics, because it's really the Austrian economics that attaches such importance to the short-term interest rate. But this was welcomed by some post-Keynesians who regarded this means the central banks were coming to their senses, accepting monetary endogeneity, but at the same time, while at the same time disputing that you should use the rate of interest as an instrument of policy, and arguing that actually interest rates should be permanently kept low. Let me see. In all of this emerges one of the more colourful figures of monetary economics, Warren Mosler, a hedge fund manager who lives as a tax exile in the American Virgin Islands. He does not live modestly. I'm told by, in fact, Alan Pardes, who went there to visit him, told me that Warren Mosler lives in a Scottish castle. He took a fancy to the Scottish castle, so he transported it stone by stone to the American Virgin Islands. Totally the wrong climate for this, and he lives there in a state of sad exile, because I say sad exile because the tax laws in the United States are such that he's assessed on his if he ever sets foot in the United States, he's assessed on his annual income in proportion to the number of days that he spends in the United States, so that his marginal cost of coming to stay in the United States is extremely high, because it's not just the cost of the hotel, but it's the cost of the tax on that day's income which he has to pay. Warren Mosler has financed a number of activities, including the work of, I should say, a much more serious economist, Randall Wray, who's regarded as part of the post-Keynesian, or certainly regards himself as part of the post-Keynesian group of school of economists. Randall Wray was a student of Minsky's. Modern money theory really derives its essential ideas partly from Keynes. Randall Wray always says it's Keynes, Schumpeter, Minsky, but really it's from one Keynesian economist, Amartya Lerner, who put forward important principles of fiscal policy known as functional finance. In other words, that these are Lerner's ideas were that financial deficits can always be financed in some way or another. And the government fiscal deficit can always be financed. The fiscal deficit should be determined by the needs of the economy. A very laudable, I would say, and correct view. Added to this is Randall Wray and Mosler attached to this the chartism of an economist called Georg Friedrich Knapp. Georg Friedrich Knapp advocated the views, Germany, economist of the first part of the 20th century, advocated the view that all money ultimately is a debt of the government. And I always promise myself that next time I see Randall Ray, I will give him this Scottish £5 note. This is a Scottish £5 note, which is a liability not of the government of the United Kingdom, not even a liability of the Scottish government, it's a liability of a Scottish commercial bank. So it is money, but it is not government money. And this is, but this is a trivial point really. The more serious issue around this, around modern money theory. Modern money theory is developed more or less into 3 or 4 doctrines which really go far beyond anything advocated by Keynes and Lerner and I guess now. First of all, the notion that all government expenditure is monetary expansion. Now this is not just the fiscal deficit, all government expenditure at the time of expenditure comes in the form of money. Nowadays, bank money. Secondly, the notion that taxes give value. Taxes are only necessary to give value to money. In other words, it's not necessary for government expenditure to be covered by tax revenue. Taxes are only necessary to give value to money. In what sense? Well, this is in the sense that when we, the reason why we hold money is because we pay our taxes with money. The third, as a result of this, fiscal deficits do not matter. And fourthly, the Keynesian fiscal stimulus can create full employment through an employer of last resort. This is a particular idea of Warren Mosler. Now, I will class modern money theory really with the ideas that Keynes put forward, in the class of ideas that Keynes referred to as the ideas of monetary reformers, who believe that the failures of capitalism can be eliminated by some kind of monetary reform. There were people like Irving Fisher, who at one time argued for stamped money, that if you put a date stamp on banknotes, after which the banknotes ceased being money, then this would encourage sufficient spending in the economy to overcome the problems of insufficient demand. There were similar ideas put forward by Sigurd Geisel, Major Douglas. And I think modern money theory works like this. I believe that in general, I think it may work in the United States, but it would not work in smaller, open economies. I've spoken with people in Greece, for example, who argue that, of course, modern money theory would work in Greece if Greece exited from the European Monetary Union if the Greek government implemented the ideas of modern money theory, then very quickly the Greek economy would go to full employment. And I'm afraid it wouldn't, because taxes, yes, it's true that we would hold Greek money, Greeks would hold Greek money to pay their taxes, but that's the only reason, that's the only thing they would hold Greek money for. Everything else they would hold euros for. It would be a way of euroizing the economy. And I think similar view holds for local money as well. Let me just come to my final point, which is about the monetary policy and the business cycle. If you, and I'll say something about Kalecki. Why? Because I think Kalecki's monetary ideas are very interesting and relevant here. Unfortunately, they were overshadowed by Keynes's ideals. And Kalecki never really developed them. I think if one reads Kalecki in detail, what he has to say about money, it becomes clear that for Kalecki, it's not just the money supply that is endogenous, but also monetary policy and interest rates. They are also endogenous in the sense that they are determined by the business cycle. Inflation targeting really is a way in which, when we say, when central banks say, okay, we will now conduct monetary policy, we'll raise interest rates if inflation is rising, and lower interest rates when inflation is falling. This is simply a way in which central banks declare themselves to be committed to doing what's determined by the business cycle. It's a way in which the monetary policy, the business cycle controls monetary policy through inflation targeting, rather than, as central bankers believe, how monetary policy controls, how monetary policy controls the business cycle. Sorry, this is incorrectly put up on the board. It is, in other words, inflation targeting gives central banks the delusion that they're controlling the business cycle. It is, in fact, the business cycle that is controlling monetary policy. And I'll show this by really showing certain key indicators of what's happened in the Eurozone. You can see the the brown indicator, or reddish brown indicator, which is the gross fixed capital formation, and the one that goes close to it, the blue one, is GDP growth. It's very clear that it is, as Kalecki said, it's investment that determines the GDP growth. The two figures at the top are the rate of inflation and the central bank's interest rate, and these really go up and down, but have really respond to the business cycle, lag the business cycle, rather than determine it. So I think this is why we need a monetary theory to understand how money operates in the economy. What I haven't discussed, and I'd be very willing and very happy to discuss, monetary policy is important for the financial system, as Minsky argued. It really has very little impact on the real economy. And that I believe is the key lesson of the last crisis. And I think it's a lesson which is starting to be taken abroad in the mainstream. That this is what we need central banks for, to assure financial stability, that they can have very little influence on the business side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jana. I saw the whole listening with full attention to presentation at the risk that we practically run short of time. Nevertheless, I would like to leave some room for questions and answers. But I would love to ask the potential speakers to be concise and not to extend 2-3 minutes each, so that we could give some opportunities to a number of people who would like to raise questions. Please do introduce yourselves. And then, I don't know, I think probably you collect a few questions and then answer, okay? So we start the question and the answer. Yes.
From Warsaw University. Can you please put quantitative easing in the context of this policy, please? And also, you say that the financial system doesn't determine the real system. That is what I understood you said right at the end. Is that completely accurate? Because that doesn't appear to be what's happened. The financial system did affect the real system.
Tomasz Janes, University of Warsaw. In Poland, the traditional instruments of controlling money supply have actually little impact on the money supply. I mean, like open market operations or controlling the inflation expectations, which is also important. But what about financing budget deficit, which is currently forbidden by Polish constitution? If we allow the central bank to buy governmental bonds, would it lead to having like more control over money supply by government, and therefore could lead to more control on the stability of financial markets?
Okay. I don't think it's prohibited by the Constitution. I think it is in the law of the National Bank. I think it's a lady here. Sorry.
I've got 2 short questions.
Could you introduce yourself?
Piotr Stefanowski, investment partners, just running the company. Could you indicate any maybe entity, maybe a private sector, financial sector, who will really have real influence on the monetary policy? Against what you said, that public institutions does not have. My second question is just a very short one. Would you recommend Poland to enter Eurozone? Thank you.
Stanisław Adamczyk, Szkoła Główna Handlowa, Jana Toporowskiego. In the modern world, we have a problem of the linking of the financial system from the real economy. Do you think that one of these theories can help to solve the problem? Thank you.
Stanisław Walukiewicz, Polish Academy of Sciences. I'd like to back to the quotation of Kalecki You simply said that to start entrepreneurship, you have to have your own capital. But I think right now you have to look more generally. Simply, is to become a capitalist, simply to hire other people, not yourself, but only other people. You should take some responsibility to be brave. Instead of putting your money, your own money, into bank from saving account, you should put it to action, just to work capital. And that depends also on psychological. So simply I can formulate such a question. It's very, very important question recently in economics. From what the social capitals come from? Simply the origin of social capitals. Well, people start the entrepreneurship activity because it's not obvious. It depends very much on the conditions. Some people will be not so encouraged to start. That's my question. Thank you.
Let's stop at that moment and let Professor Toporowski answer the questions, and then if there are more questions, we will have another round.
Okay. So we start off with the issue of quantitative easing. Quantitative easing has been very, very important. It's been very, very important for providing liquidity for the financial markets. But it really hasn't had much impact on the real economy. It's provided enormous liquidity, not just on the financial markets in North America and in Europe, but for many emerging markets. And this is a problem for many emerging markets. And therein lies a difficulty, because if you're going to provide such kind of liquidity, how are you going to regulate such liquidity? But it was certainly a very positive thing that the central banks did. And I'll come back to...
well, before you do, with your permission, I think that policy of providing massive liquidity to the banking system was called a Keynesian policy. This is far not the essence of Keynesian policy. Keynesian policy is stimulating demand and not improving the reserves of commercial banks. That was money that never has been put into circulation. Now, money that is within the bank vault is not money. It's printed pieces of paper. It improved the liquidity position of the banking sector, but it did not stimulate the demand. So all that criticism that followed, that you had a Keynesian stimulus, but not a rise in rate of growth, was ill-conceived, because it couldn't. It did not stimulate any demand.
You're quite right. The other thing was that it actually fed a political passivity, because governments persuaded themselves that the central bank can do it. The central bank cannot do it. Yeah, let me move on to, oh yes, financial system. I did not argue that the financial system does not affect the real economy. It most certainly does. And in the case of the last crisis, it played a very, very crucial role in that it was because the financial system decay was blocked in 2008, 2007, 2008, that what was a financial crisis became a broader economic crisis because of the debt problems that it caused for business corporations. On the financing of budget deficits, this is this is a less serious issue than it sometimes appears. You know, according to the regulations, the central bank is not supposed to provide overdraft facilities for the central government. This doesn't matter, providing the central bank is willing to refinance commercial banks that do provide those facilities. You can do this indirectly, and this is what in effect has been happening. Where this may be a difficulty is that if you bind the central bank and the government with too many restrictions, it prevents the government and the central bank from undertaking those financial operations which it may be necessary to keep the financial markets liquid. And if this happens at a time when, for example, as happened in 2008, the large corporations are loaded down with short-term debt, then this can cause serious difficulties, and certainly did cause serious difficulties in 2008. Private sector entity influencing monetary policy. I mean, in general, I think, yes, there are private sector entities that influence monetary policy and that should rightly influence government monetary policy, and those are banks. I'm unashamedly of the view that banks should be regulated, but you should not allow banks to collapse, because one does need to have a functioning financial system. I do have a colleague who advocates the demolition of the banking system as the first step towards socialism in Greece, and this is what I call having North Korea by the Acropolis. It's not something that's designed. On the other hand, you said you asked should Poland enter the Eurozone. At the present moment, there is a very serious gap in the system of financial regulation and stabilization, and that is there's a problem of the lender of last resort. The banking system needs a lender of last resort. If you don't allow the central bank to provide this, then the government has to provide this, and then you have to look at the consequences of this for government in getting this. And part of the reason why the European Monetary Union is in such a mess is that the European Central Bank pretended that it had no responsibility as a lender of last resort. Governments had to do this themselves. As a result, governments which before the crisis, like the government of Ireland, for example, had fairly good debt to GDP ratios, suddenly found themselves heavily into debt. This is a problem. This is a mess created by Maastricht. Now, Europe is now trying to overcome this. They are introducing new measures. There's the creation of a banking union. Poland does need to have access to a lender of last resort facilities, and that, I think, for me, is more important than the currency issue. Certainly, the European Monetary Union, as constituted as present, it's not a very good place to be, but nor is where Poland is at the moment. So it's not a nice choice to make. At the same time, I'm aware that within the Eurozone, there are members of the Eurozone who are pressing for reform of the European Monetary Union. And I guess for political reasons, this might be a political reason why Poland maybe should support those plans and efforts. But whether these are best supported from within or from outside, I'm not sure myself. Delinking of the real economy and the financial economy. Yes, this is most apparent in countries like the United States and the UK, which in effect operate as international financial intermediaries. Poland doesn't have this problem yet. Poland is not an international financial intermediary, although possibly maybe on a smaller scale within Eastern Europe. I'm not. There is. People talk about delinking because you have once you have long-term debt markets, the provision of liquidity for those long-term debt markets creates levels of activity within the banking system which appear unrelated to what's happening in the real economy. Actually, what we should be looking at, what we need to look at much, much more, is what's happening in the financial system of the big corporations, because that is where the real link between the financial system and the economy is happening. And that, I think, is something which central banks should be much more aware of. And politicians. Can one of these prosperity theories be used? I must say, I find some of these, some of the doctrines to be a little bit abstract. As I say, I think on the circuit theory of money is very good actually on looking at how money and credit circulates in the economy, even if this assumption about all working capital, credit being a single working capital is maybe unreal. This I think is useful. It's important to know how credit circulates to understand, for example, how quantitative easing is affecting the emerging markets, or how the quantitative easing of the central bank may be affecting the liquid assets held by corporations, which I think is a key factor. Modern money theories, possibly, some of this is verging on monetary reform. Monetary endogeneity, I think central bankers have said this today. A lot of what Postkeynesovs have been arguing is accepted. And the fact that they're not found in the textbooks, I find strange, because actually a lot of Postkeynesov economists, I myself try to do this, Mark Lavoie as well, do speak to central bankers and have relations with them, and one has a good interchange views. Putting capital into action. Yes, this question I think is absolutely fundamental, because the key problem that it now exists, the key financial problem in the economy appears as a problem of over-indebtedness. An aspect of this almost the credit counterpart of over-indebtedness are the large holdings of liquid assets by the big corporations. Very, very large in the United States, somewhat more modest, but you can see a very sharp rise in holdings of liquid assets by European corporations since 2010, in part because they've been because of balance sheet operations when there was fear of the breakup of the European Union. Now, ways have to be found of getting those holdings into productive circulation, whether it's done by taxes, which are then spent by the government, or somehow inducing corporations to invest. There are various ways in which the instruments which can be done. Certainly by government investment is very, very important in this. But to do this, you really have to have a loosening up of this financial regulations, or find ways of bypassing. That I think is extremely important. But for me, investment is the key, and it's perhaps a fiscal policy in the service of this. Although I agree with the general Keynesian view that you need to have more government expenditure, but let's have more government expenditure on infrastructure rather than probably more important than and in this way you can what saves on welfare expenditure.
Thank you, Alex.
I'm sure we run out of time already, so
yes, okay. And this is the last question.
My name is Wojciech Zagala. I'm a retired once Warsaw University. I've got a practical question, a paradox that I'm trying to grapple with. Maybe you could throw some light on it. And the basic question is, in 1920s, we did have hyperinflation and a massive expansion of the money supply. Now, today, or for the last few years, we have quantitative easing, which, in my mind, also equals to a massive money supply. And we don't seem to have inflation, or immediate inflation, as a side effect. However, from what I read is that half of this quantitative easing purchases goes into, say, toxic assets, but half into the government bonds. So eventually, someone has to pay. Or has money lost its value? Thank you.
This is a very common idea about money and finance, that eventually someone has to pay. And this is in particular a common idea about finance. Yes, if you or I borrow money, this is we have to pay our debts. But even you or I, if we can't pay our debts, what do? We refinance. And if you look at corporate finance, if you understand corporate finance properly, businesses, large businesses, actually never pay their debts. What do? They refinance. They refinance until eventually they refinance into equity, into shares. And once you've refinanced into shares, then you certainly never have to pay your debts. Now, okay, this is an extreme example, but governments can also do this. So, these operations do go on and it's certainly possible to do it. In fact, actually, for the government, I would say debt should never be a problem, because the government can always finance its debt burden. I would recommend everyone here should read Kalecki's essay on political business side. What was it called? Political aspect. Political aspects of full employment. Because Kalecki there in 2 sentences says how you deal with the burden of financing of government debt. It's very simple. You introduce a wealth tax. The wealth tax equal to the value of the debt servicing. Why a wealth tax? Well, because a wealth tax doesn't reduce anyone's income, doesn't reduce anyone's expenditure. You pay it out of your wealth. You pay it in proportion of your wealth. If it's equal to the amount of debt servicing, then you can forget about the problem of debt servicing. This is a very simple answer. Unfortunately, in recent years, in the last 20, 30 years, governments have become terrified of introducing wealth taxes. They're a very good thing. In the case of real estate, they cannot be evaded. It's a very, very good thing, and I think this is one of the reasons why, whatever doubt there may be about Piketty's figures, his idea that a wealth tax is necessary. Yes, a wealth tax is necessary, precisely so that we can forget about the problem of debt service.
Okay. Now, since this series of lectures is, in a sense, an extension and continuation of the seminar we run here together with Professor Lasky on post-Keynesian, post-Kaleckian economics, let me make a few comments and emphasize some points that were raised by Professor Toporowski and which link closely to what we have extensively discussed in the course of those seminars. First, while Professor Toporowski is right, emphasizing that there is no inflation theory in Keynes, there is one in Kalecki. There is the theory of prices. There is the assumption that the distribution of income doesn't change over the course of business cycle. And therefore, as long as wages increase in step with labor productivity, so that the relative shares remain unchanged, and prices of manufacturing products are determined on the basis of unit prime costs, there is no inflation. Inflation starts only when you have attempts at a change of the income distribution. This, to some extent, I think that it's, perhaps it was not emphasized enough in the course of your presentation, and that is that the OPEC crisis resulted from the fact of huge change in terms of trade between oil net producers and oil net consumers. And there was the problem who should share that burden. And no one wanted to. And this is how the acceleration of inflation started. It didn't have anything to do with
too much of demand compared to productive capacities. That, as I said, that we have discussed in the course of our seminar. I think it is important to see that there is this alternative way of looking at income distribution and price-making mechanisms, inflation generation mechanisms. Of course, nowadays, Kalecki's approach may seem inadequate, but nevertheless, you have an explanation of what happened, and I think the explanation is relevant. The second point relates to Abba Lerner and his functional finance theory. Again, we have discussed it quite extensively in the course of the seminar, but let me re-emphasize this. You see, what Professor Toporowski was telling us and what you can see in this paper of 1943 of Abba Lerner is that the government, in contrast to individuals, can finance its expenses by money emission. No limit to it until full capacity of factors of production is reached. Okay? And it's the decision of the government how much of the debt, of that deficit is to be financed by money emission and how much by creating a new debt by issuing government obligations, government bonds and bills. Why, on what basis the government makes this decision according to Lerner? This decision is not decided by the amount of total savings or whatever. It is decided by the government wishing to influence the rate of interest so as to make the public to save more or less. This is, according to this theory, the criterion for making this decision. Now, again, as mentioned by Professor Toporowski, this is relevant for countries that are sovereign over their money and their debt. So it's the United States, or Japan, all the debt of which is financed by the Japanese. And of course, for these reasons, it cannot be the case for Greece. And the final point I want to make is, again, to re-emphasize the meaning of Professor Toporowski's comment on, if you could go to this slide with structuralists, with direction better. Yeah. And then, okay. Loans create the deposits. Please know, this is, well, it's clear signal we must finish. Okay. This is a denial of the loanable fund theory, that you need to have a certain amount of deposits in order to be able to grant a credit. Not at all. You first give credits, and then you create incomes from which savings come back to the banking system in the form of deposits. And it's far not true that if you want to invest, you need to bring on a lash a saver so that the bank can loan you the savings of the saver. Commercial banks, in a sense, create money ex nihilo. I think, again, we discussed it in the course of the seminar, and I think this is an important conclusion, which I think follows from Professor Toporowski's presentation. Would you like to respond to this?
I will just answer, make one point in response to what you said, and that's on this point of loans create deposits. I think that this is, if you read the textbooks, you get very simplified versions of the way in which the banking system operates. Once you understand how a credit system operates through the creation of loans, it's actually a revelation about the financial system, and in fact it can lead to certain paradoxical conclusions. One of them being that if an economy is in a debt crisis, the easiest way out of it, the only effective way out of it, is what? It's to take out even more debt and create incomes with it, create credit in the economy, because when you take out a loan and spend it, this is a way of creating income. And with those incomes, you can service the debt. So yes, debt is the answer to a debt crisis.
Okay, well, I think we've finished. I'm afraid perhaps you may come up after we finish and talk with Professor Toporowski. I think we should applaud for excellent presentation and